Well, welcome to the Public Safety and Veterans Subcommittee meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of December 9th?
So moved.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Minutes pass. And we have call to the public. We have 3 cards. Jeff, if you come on down. Just state your name and address.
Yeah, Jeff Woods, 15234 North 23rd Drive, Phoenix, Arizona 85023. My call to the public, I've been told that the Community Police Trust Initiative has been finalized, and I just want asking if there is a call to the public on that at City Council, or who is going to present that to the public so it can be discussed. I know there's a lot of concerns within the community that everything that we've been talking about as far as accountability and transparency when it comes to body cameras or a police review board is very important to the community. So I'm just want to make a call to the public that we discuss that as a community with it in either a setting like this or a city council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Next would be Joanna. Or Joanne.
My name is Joanne Scott Woods. I'm co-coordinator for People Demanding Action Community Coalition. Our coalition is meeting with Assistant Chief Kurtenbach, Marshall Franklin, Commander Giordano, and Lieutenant Orender in presenting our coalition's 10 solutions for reconciliation between the community and the police. At our first meeting, we were told that one of the solutions, the Community Review Board, was one of the recommendations that was already included in the CPTI that had been completed the day before, and to call the city manager's office. I called, Corey returned my call, and I was told that when I asked at what meeting it would be presented, he said, I said the Human Relations Commission or the Public Safety and Veterans Subcommittee. He said the city manager does not have to present it to any public body. I asked, isn't it part of the 2011 and revised 2015 City Manager's Community Engagement and Outreach Task Force's 34 recommendations? And he replied that it was completely separate, and when the city manager receives the recommendations, he will decide which ones to include. I said this process lacked transparency, and his reply was that the CPTI was completely separate from any public body and that transparency was not required. I asked him to please call me back with the city manager's answer as to when the CPTI would be released with his selected recommendations. My takeaway was, isn't it ironic that the ultimate solution in the Community Police Trust Initiative are not being selected by the committee at large or the community at large and the police, but by an unelected paid employee, because we have a city manager council form of government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Woods. Kim? Oh, absolutely.
Kim Baker, 12410 West Flanagan Street, Avondale, Arizona. This is just another copy of what I shared with you all at the City Council meeting, the letter from the police chief. As the chairman of the Public and Safety Commission, Mr. Nowakowski, I'm here to ask that you not sit on the seat of apathy, sir, and do nothing, and continue to allow this to be unattentive. I would love to, again, sit down and meet with you, as the mayor has made it obvious to me. And I come to you guys again transparent. I'm here to say to the police chief, I do not personally dislike you or anything of that nature. I would actually like to meet with you too, sir. if it's at all possible. Again, this is violating public policy now. No one deserves this. Not even the officer that is named in that letter deserves to be thrown under the bus as the way he has been done. And as the chairman of this committee, sir, I believe it's your due diligence to see that this officer's name is vindicated and that the real officer who's no longer with you guys, his first name be released, since the only thing I've ever been given was the last name, that his first name be released so that if he ever attempts to come back to this city, there will be people ready to stop him being a part of this police department. I would like to meet with you, sir. Thank you.
Barker. Francisca.
Good morning. My name is Francisca Porchas, and I'm here representing Puente Human Rights Movement. We as a coalition, or a group of people that have been meeting, CNL, ACLU, had actually reached out to Councilmember Gallego. Unfortunately, she's not. Oh, there she is. She's here. About taking leadership, which hopefully will happen today, to get the CPTI's recommendations, that are now 9 from my understanding, to be a public process. We were a bit disappointed about the process that they already went through, because there was no open participation by the community. I don't know what they look like exactly yet. I think given both what's happening nationally on police brutality and violence, and then what's happened here, and the long string of deaths at the hands of the police and abuse, we need to have a transparent and open process. So we want to commend Councilmember Gallego, because we hope that Chairman Awakowski, everybody really, decides to have the Phoenix Police Department report, as well as City Manager Cirker and Assistant City Manager Dahoney, actually present on what these recommendations are here, and for it to be an open process. And ideally, we'd have community turn out for forums, for conversations around these recommendations. There's no reason for them not to. I would be very disappointed and frankly concerned and disturbed if these recommendations just solely fall on the hands of city management to decide on what is going to be implemented and how, and solely the Phoenix Police Department. And so I really hope that this happens today. And I really would like to commend your leadership, Councilwoman Gallego. Thank you.
Thank you. And would love to ask the chair to put that on a future meeting agenda item.
Absolutely. Thank you, Francisca. We have JJ.
Council members, we are at a crossroads with the city of Phoenix. The manner in which public safety is administered in this city comes from a position of morbid opacity. The city of Phoenix does not release information up until they absolutely have to. The lack of transparency is killing our citizens. The city of Phoenix was tied for 4th for the most lethal city in America to citizens last year. Over the past 4 or 5 years, it's one of the most lethal cities, period. We have to stop this. We have to retrain our officers. We're hiring 300 new officers, but we're training them in exactly the same way as the officers that we had before that weren't meeting the needs of all of our citizens. With the city manager heavy hand on this city, we have no opportunity to really impact public safety. He doesn't act as a city manager, he acts as a viceroy. And at this point, it's incumbent upon the elected officials to hold him accountable. And as we're selecting a new police chief, we need to go very diligently and be very, very careful. If the new police chief is not a reformer, then we're going to have more of the same. It's time to change this. We just had somebody killed who was trying to commit suicide, and the city obliged him. There was absolutely no reason for that man to be shot and killed. You had one officer who was sitting in his car waiting for backup, and you had another officer who charged out there and outkicked his coverage. It's ridiculous. We need to stop it, and we need to stop it now.
Thank you, JJ. Next would be, we have items 4 and 5. They are for consent.
Move approval.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Items 4 and 5 pass. We have item number 6.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I'm Karen Peters, Deputy City Manager and Liaison to the Phoenix Municipal Court. As you know, this past summer, the Mayor and Council appointed a new Chief Presiding Judge for the Phoenix Municipal Court to fill the vacancy created when former Presiding Judge Roxanne Song Ong retired. In that process, the subcommittee heard comments and concerns from the public about the transparency of the judicial selection process and the need to continue to ensure a diverse municipal court bench. Staff was directed to analyze the process and recommend any revisions to address those concerns. So this is our municipal court. Actually, not all of them are pictured here. There's at least one missing, and some of them are obscured, but as you can see, it's a very diverse court. The Phoenix City Code sets out a process for merit selection of municipal court judges. An appointed board called the Judicial Selection Advisory Board seeks out and screens candidates for appointment and then makes recommendations to the mayor and council. Traditionally, this public safety subcommittee has received the JSAB recommendations, conducted interviews, and then makes a recommendation to the full council for appointment or reappointment. Thanks to the diligence and leadership of both this subcommittee and the council, the Phoenix Municipal Court bench is the most diverse relative to Arizona state courts at all levels. You can see these numbers here. We're there on my left, your right, and we have a good record. And this chart shows you what the population of the city compared to our bench looks like. As you can see, with regard to female judges, we do fairly well, but we can do better in some of the other categories, and we need to do better to reflect the diversity of our community. Municipal court is often the first and perhaps only contact that our residents have with city government, so it's vital that residents can identify with city judges and staff. So, examining best practices in judicial recruitment and selection, staff identified several enhancements to promote transparency and diversity, and they are generally listed here. I'll describe them. First, strategic recruitment. Traditionally, what we have done, as we do with most job openings at the city, is advertise the opening to the community and then get applications. Best practices indicate that perhaps we need to do more, and so we plan to issue press releases when a judicial vacancy occurs, and we intend to do direct outreach to the leadership of various bar associations and other organizations to encourage them to help seek out applicants. The Judicial Selection Advisory Board meetings are now held here at City Hall rather than at the municipal court, so that they are more accessible to the public. And with regard to the interview process, the JSAB interviews of candidates for a vacancy will be televised on PHX 11. Application materials will clearly spell out the screening and interview process so that both the public and the applicants understand what to expect. And then lastly, with regard to items 3 and 4 on this list, what we would propose is to mirror the Arizona Constitution's provisions regarding consideration of diversity on the population in making appointments both to the JSAB and to the court bench. Specifically, as in your materials, you'll see the suggested code revisions. The Phoenix Code provision regarding selection criteria for judges differs from the merit selection language in the Arizona Constitution in at least one important aspect. Our code currently requires that the JSAB make its recommendations for judicial appointment without regard for race, religion, political affiliation, or sex of the candidate. In contrast, our state constitution requires that when making recommendations for judicial appointment, the diversity of the state's or county's population shall be considered, but the primary consideration shall be merit. Further, the state constitution suggests that the appointed commissions that seek out and screen judicial candidates, like our JSAB, should reflect the diversity of the state or county. Diverse commissions are most likely to recommend diverse candidates. So staff recommends that our code mirror the constitutional language in order to very clearly state the city's policy of inclusion and diversity at the municipal court. Proposed revisions are spelled out in Attachment B to the City Council report for this item. I want to thank the subcommittee and each of the members of the community who expressed interest in making our court the very best it can be. We are now working to implement the recommended administrative changes, the moves, and the television broadcasts, and staff requests that the subcommittee recommend City Council approval of the code revisions presented in Attachment B. Happy to answer any questions.
I asked my colleagues that we have one card. Should we listen to the one card and then maybe have our comments after that? Okay. Arthur Garcia.
Chairman, members of the subcommittee, the Arizona Republic stated in an article that Governor Ducey had passed over a chance to appoint the first African-American justice to the Arizona Supreme Court, nor in the 103-year history of the Arizona Supreme Court has there ever been an Hispanic justice. I received a letter from the Southern Poverty Law Center that states, "My dear friend, police operating under an illegal racket took Harriet Cleveland away from her home and threw her in jail for failure to pay a traffic fine. She was about to feed her 2-year-old grandson breakfast when the cops led her away in handcuffs. Her crime? She was too poor to keep up payments to a profiteering private probation company in charge of collecting her minor traffic fines in Montgomery, Alabama. Here's how the scheme works and how it's being used in hundreds of cities to skirt a United States Supreme Court ruling that says a person cannot be jailed for the inability to pay a traffic fine. Cities contract with a private debt collection companies working under the guise of probation. Then city judges assign them to collect monthly payments from people too poor to pay their fines all at once. Each month, the company tacks on a $40 fee for its own profits. When poor people can't pay, the company threatens jail. If they still can't keep up, they are reported to the judge, who rules them in violation of probation and orders them to jail. What do these two stories have in common? The Judicial Selection Advisory Board. The board is an elitist nominating committee. The 8-member board has 5 lawyer members, 3 of them judges. That's 3 judges out of 8 members. The state nominating commissions has 1 judge, the Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court, and it's a 16-member commission. So why do we have 3 judges? Lawyers are an elite group, and judges are the power elite of the elite. One of the judges is appointed by the Arizona Supreme Court, usually the Chief Justice. The other appointed judge is appointed by the presiding judge of Maricopa County Superior Court, a body with little diversity and is becoming whiter every year. That's because all the appointments by Governor Hall are now retiring, and the new governors have failed to appoint minority judges. The two lawyers are nominated by the county and state bar association. The state bar is more diverse than the county bar only because it's a mandatory bar, but neither represents the diversity of the city of Phoenix. There are 5 lawyers, and none of them have practiced before the city court, including the presiding judge, who was an administrator. So you ask yourself, what expertise are they presenting in the selection of judges? Why couldn't these be non-attorneys? Now, the state nominating commission has 10 non-lawyers, 5 lawyers, and the chief justice. So why should the city, a criminal misdemeanor court, have 5 lawyers out of 8? We don't need 5 lawyers. 2 lawyers is enough, the presiding judge, and you can have 5 non-lawyers who are more representative of the city, especially if none of them come from the same district. The Judicial Selection Advisory Board is a legacy of the age of discrimination. You should change it. If you do not change the membership of the JSAB and the method by which members are selected, you will fail to give the residents of the city of Phoenix, especially minority residents, a voice in the selection of their judges, and you failed as leaders.
Arthur, if you can wrap it up.
Okay, real quick. As for the Phoenix City Court procedures, pursuant to a question by City Councilwoman Pastor, the presiding judge responded that the City Court did not engage in the practices detailed in the letter from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So should we trust him, or, as Ronald Reagan stated, trust but verify? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any comments from my colleagues?
I would just say that in the compliance system agenda item today, we're going to be addressing some of the concerns related to payment options and making sure that people have economic opportunity. So there will be good news later in the meeting today, but we'll go back to the very important issue. I really want to recognize Chairman Nowakowski, because this has been his leadership to make sure that we have as good of a process as possible. And he and his team have put a lot of time into researching best practices all over the country. So thank you to the chairman for bringing us this important agenda item.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Could you explain the makeup of the JSAB? I think JSAB.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Councilwoman Pastor, the Judicial Selection Advisory Board membership is set out in Phoenix City Code, and it includes, hold on. As the code indicates and as Mr. Garcia indicates, the presiding judge of the Superior Court of Maricopa County or his designee, an appellate court judge to be appointed by the Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court, a member of the Maricopa County Bar Association who resides in the city of Phoenix and is appointed by the mayor, an active member of the State Bar of Arizona, also a resident of Phoenix, appointed by the mayor, and then 3 public members who are nominated by the mayor, and all of these nominations are approved by the city council. So that is what the code provisions direct regarding the makeup of the JSAB. And as I said, they are instructed by the code to seek out, they are the recruiters, in addition to the advertising and outreach that we're proposing.
Councilmember Pastor?
So to look at the code and possibly provide revisions to the code, what is the process?
The code changes that are before you today have been vetted by the law department. We're proposing that the subcommittee recommend them to the full council for adoption. And what they would do is, as I said previously, let me get back to that slide.
I guess I need to clarify. I want to know what the process is in the JSAB, since that's in the Phoenix Code. What is the process to look at it to revise the Phoenix Code of the membership of the JSAB?
What we're proposing today is that when appointments to the JSAB are made, that the diversity of the city's population shall be considered. We do a pretty good job at this, but this is the Arizona constitutional language, and we want to adopt it in our code so that that is a requirement.
I think
guess-
just
Go ahead.
some clarification is that Mr. Garcia brought up some points that you have lawyers and you have judges on our membership, and that how do you get lay people and other individuals that reflect the diversity of our community on there? Because right now, I guess you have to have, according to city code, somebody from the Supreme Court, somebody from the county, and somebody from the state.
Correct. We looked at what the state and county commissions look like. As Mr. Garcia indicated, there are 15 members compared to our 7, and evaluated whether or not we wanted to expand. We got a lot of feedback from various aspects of the community that this particular commission or this particular board does a lot of vetting. They interview each candidate, and to have 15 members rather than 8 or 7, I should say, would greatly expand and make it a little bit burdensome to interview the number of judges that we want to have come through the process. We want to encourage as many as possible to come through the process. So what we did, again, acknowledge is that this constitutional requirement that we propose to adopt would ensure that there is diversity in terms of the number of lay people versus lawyers. Again, open to changes, but again, adopting this particular recommendation would allow us to keep our eye on the ball. Let's watch and see how this works. My expectation is that we'll continue to see very good, diverse candidates come forward from the board. The diversity of the community shall be considered when making appointments to the board. The universe of applicants for judges, of course, people need to be admitted to the State Bar of Arizona. And so having people with that expertise is helpful as well in evaluating the candidates.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Ms. Peters, I think the actual crux of what she's asking you is generically, if they wanted to change the language in the code, what's the process for that?
Oh, certainly. You could direct us to come back with language that that does that, and then you guys could evaluate it and recommend it to the council, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
For the clarification.
Any other questions?
I have a question about encourage diverse commission. Having a diverse commission is more likely to lead a more diverse applicant pool. How would this commission be selected? It's bullet number 2. Is this the JSAB membership?
Correct.
Okay.
The JSAB membership. The proposed change that's before you today would not change the process. It would simply require that in making the appointments, that diversity is considered.
Okay, thank you.
And just clarification right now, the person that does appoint all members would be the mayor, right? Except for the 3 individuals that are.
That's correct. The nominations are made by the mayor except for those 3 that are specified, but the full city council appoints the membership.
Any other questions?
I made a comment.
Comment?
First of all, thank you, Karen. I know that you spent a lot of time on this. I agree with the changes you're making. I think it is extremely important that merit is first and diversity is second, because we have always had the privilege of having excellent, outstanding judges. And I think our record shows we are very diverse in our judges. I want to see that practice continued. I'm more than willing to make that change. I think it is important that there is some emphasis on diversity. But I think when it comes to the JSAB, you need some peers to do some of the evaluations of these lawyers. I don't think lay people necessarily look or have the same high standards that someone who's in the profession would have. I think their opinion is extremely important and should be part of the process. But I think when you're deciding on merit, you have to be able to interpret their record. Thank you.
Any other comments or?
I just, Karen, I know that we've been working on this ever since the presiding judge selection. I was looking at attachment A, and in there, I don't see American Indian. Is that also a 0?
I believe so,
Okay,
yes.
because it's not part of the list. So,
No.
I was just wanting to know. Okay. Thank you.
I just have some comments. First of all, I just want to thank Ms. Peters for all her hard work and efforts in making this possible. The transparency, transferring the meetings over here to this conference room is going to really help out a lot in the whole process and understanding the process, and especially when you're interviewing individuals. The other thing is that just to build the trust of the community so that they are a part of the whole process is something great. And I'd like to thank all the stakeholders that were a part of getting us to this point that we're at right now. I'd be very supportive of this if somebody makes a motion to approve this, but maybe in the future we should look at maybe the makeup of the committee itself, and maybe look at some of the best practices that are out there throughout the state and the country to and maybe you can bring those recommendations later on in the near future. So, yes, ma'am.
I would move staff's recommendation for the changes on the judicial recommendations.
Second.
And appointments.
Already, we have a motion and a second. Any questions or comments? All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, Ms. Peters, for all your hard work. We're on item number 7. Update on licensing of scrap metal. Chris.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and council members. We would like to present to you a recommendation today to reinstate city licensing for scrap metal dealers. We have about 60 scrap metal dealers in the city of Phoenix. We once had city licensing, but then state law was passed. And I'm going to present to you Lieutenant Ben Leuschner. He oversees our scrap metal team of detectives, and he's going to give you a little overview and what we're going to request today.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning, Chairman Nowakowski, members of the subcommittee. My name is Ben Leuschner. I'm the lieutenant of the Property Crimes Unit, which includes our burglary and theft squads, our street crimes detail, warrant interdiction detail, pawn shop detail, and then that includes the metal theft detectives. So that's why this is obviously very important to us. I'm here to present the report that you have before you on the topic of the scrap metal licensing by the city. And as the chief said, the police department recommends that the city reinstate the licensing of scrap metal dealers. I'll briefly go over just the 4 subsets in the report which detail the conformity issues or the need for conformity with state law. The first one is the definition of scrap dealers. We're not requesting any change to city definition because that already conforms to state law. The second one is the reporting thresholds. This also needs to conform to state law. The transaction limitations, which basically the state law states that anything above $300 in non-ferrous metals, which is your copper and aluminum, has to be sent by check to the seller of the items. Air conditioning coils are the exemption to this. There is no threshold for this, and that can only be paid by check. The one last item is the prohibited transaction of municipal storm grates. The city recommends conforming with the state law on this because it protects the city's property. As the chief said, this issue obviously just came up because in 2013, we no longer licensed scrapyard dealers. The state law was changed in 2014, which now allows for that, and that's why we are now here to recommend to have the language developed so that the city can re-enter the licensing of city scrapyards. Thank you.
Any comments?
Mr. Chair? If I recall, about 3 or 4 years ago, this was a very hot topic at this subcommittee because of the tremendous number of thefts. And I know that in the northern area, I remember a commander going and saying, okay, he went to one of these dealers, he picked out Phoenix manhole covers, I-17 wires had been stripped right off the poles, and there was all the evidence. So I think it's extremely important that we license these people so that you have a handle on some method of checking to find the evidence, hunt down the perps, whatever. But I think this is warranted, and I wholly support it.
Thank you, Councilmember Williams. I'd like to really thank Councilmember Claude Maddox that really picked this up as and championed this whole cause and really coordinated efforts among all the sheet metal industry. And one of the things that we've seen was just a cut. At one time, people were stealing copper out of new development homes and schools, air conditioning units and all. And we really cut that almost and more than half. And now we're starting to see that the development of houses are starting to come back and people are starting to build again. And now we're starting to see a rise in copper thefts, air conditioning and all that. So I think it's great timing. And I just really want to thank once again Claude Maddox for his efforts in making this all possible. Any other comments?
Thank you for your leadership on this. I agree with Councilwoman Williams. This is enormously important. And we continue to have some pretty heartbreaking stories about metal theft, people who have attacked churches, nonprofits who serve our most vulnerable, and frankly, people doing incredibly dangerous things like trying to take metal out of electric substations where they are risking their lives. So it really is a win for our community if we can crack down on the illegal and make sure that we do support the people who are doing this right, because recycling is valuable and these are expensive metals, which we would rather have reused when appropriate, and so that the good, we can really separate the good actors from the bad actors. Right now, cans are not something we have jurisdiction from, and I would love to get your thoughts on whether if something moves forward at the state legislature, the city might support also allowing us to include cans in our programs, should the state permit. Is that something that?
We did bring government relations with us today to discuss that if necessary. We work this closely with government relations and the city clerk's office, and they're both here for support.
Excellent. If I asked for winning lottery numbers, did you bring someone who could help me with those as well? Okay.
Mr. Chair and Councilwoman Gallego, to answer your question, you are correct. There was legislation that passed last session that had nothing to do with the issue of scrap metal. And what happened was it was an issue that restricted the ability for cities to regulate certain types of containers, whether they be plastic, whether they be aluminum, what have you. And it was the interpretation of the law department, after scrubbing that bill down, that the provision of being able to have this ordinance and give the police department the ability to regulate aluminum cans was out of bounds. It could not be done. So therefore, after much discussion with all the internal stakeholders, the issue of reinstating the license is moving forward without that provision because of state law, the restrictions placed in state law.
Wonderful. And so we are moving forward with developing our state legislative agenda. So I could put something in a motion today about that, or if it's something you're already bringing forward, what would be your
Mr.
preferred?
Chair, Councilwoman Gallego, however you want to handle it, I am aware that and I don't know to what extent the industry, and when I say the industry, the scrap metal industry, is going to pursue it, but I understand that in the interim, they were seeking the ability to change that section of state law in some way that would allow local jurisdictions to regulate cans, and they would be very focused on aluminum. I have not seen a piece of legislation that has been introduced yet to do that. It may happen, it may not happen, but of course, it's the council at the end of the day that gives, the direction to staff, to government relations, to pursue or assist any type of effort to reinstate aluminum cans as a potential item that can be regulated by this ordinance.
But I think what we're hearing from the police department is that having that ability, it's be an additional tool and to be able to work with, so that would have some value.
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Okay. I think that might be something where we might provide a supporting role and testimony and give our government affairs folks the ability to sign in support if the industry does decide to move forward with legislation. I imagine the legislature did not intend to do that and that they would want our police department to have the full set of tools to address metal-related issues. Excellent. So,
And just for those listening, you're probably saying, why are we worried about aluminum cans? What's going on is that you see signs out there, 90 cents a pound for aluminum cans. The going market is under 60 cents in the state of Arizona. In California, it is actually over close to $1 or so. So what's happening is people are collecting cans here and shipping them back to California. So I know that at the state level, California and Arizona, they're trying to work something out to prevent individuals taking aluminum cans from the state of Arizona into California. And then what happens there is that a lot of times they gather scrap metal also. And they're gathering the scrap metal illegally where they don't follow the guidelines that we have. And that's why we're concerned about these aluminum can collectors, because they're also collecting scrap metal and copper and all those. So with that,
You want a motion?
if we can have a
Wonderful.
motion.
with that, I make a motion that we draft an ordinance to conform with state law regarding reporting thresholds, transaction limitations, and prohibited transaction, and that we initiate a stakeholder notification within 30 days so that we are within the window of the state legislative session on the proposed changes and reinstatement of licensing in Phoenix, that we add to our legislative agenda support for giving the city authority to work with aluminum cans, and that we return to the subcommittee no later than March so that we can move forward while the legislature is in session.
Second.
All righty, we have 2 seconds, and
Oh,
all
sorry.
those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I bet you were pretty confident that was going to pass.
Absolutely. Now we have item number 8, that's our budget update.
I don't have 8 in my packet.
Morning. Want to give you an update of where we're at through 5 months of the fiscal year. We currently have spent $241 million, and we're at 43% of our budget. And then, as you can see, our monthly expenditures for November compared to this year, compared to last year, we're 9% higher than we were.
I'm sorry, just for those individuals out there, this is the police budget, right?
Yes, this is the police budget, I'm sorry. Our top 10 expenditures haven't changed. They continue to be mostly personal services. With the exception of this month, we have equipment management charges, and we continue to have jail services on our top 10 expenditures. And then our revenues.
Can we go back to the last slide? Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I'm going to talk a little bit about overtime at the end of this presentation. If you'll note, our overtime expenditures have significantly increased in the past this year compared to last year, and I'm going to address those at the end.
All right. And our revenues for 5 months are pretty much the same as last year, except for a couple items, which would be our court awards. And we had requested additional funds for court awards last year for our RMS system. And then our IGAs and task force, we got additional funds last year for the Southwest border, the support that we provided for them. And Chief Yarner will go over the overtime.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, the last couple slides, I'm just going to highlight them a little bit. And this is through the end of the year, so it's at 6 months. So different than what Jill just provided at 5 months. And at 5 months, our budget, we were at 43% spent, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We're a little bit high in our overtime in the last 6 months, so at the mid-year, we're going to continue to look hard at overtime. Civilian overtime, what we spent this year is $1.2 million, and sworn is at $13.5 million. And the main contributors to the sworn overtime is minimum staffing, which a little over $5 million. Supplemental staffing is additional officers that we employ in the precincts, and this is all first responders. This is not detectives. This is not anything outside of the patrol division. Supplemental and minimum staffing is all patrol-based to provide service on the front end as a response to calls for service. Another contributing factor to our increase in overtime in the last 6 months compared to the previous year is RMS. We've had some costs and go live. We've had to have the ability to have officers at a 24-hour hotline so that officers can call and get answers to the new system as they provide their reports and move forward in their law enforcement activities. Next slide. So why have we spent so much in minimum staffing? We have a 75% minimum staffing guideline that we go by. I know on any particular day, on any particular shift, in any particular precinct, how many officers we need at a minimum to be safe and to be effective on the street. And we need to meet those. So that's why we're spending some of our money. So our first responder pool is down about 132 officers since October of 14. We are averaging, calling in 37 officers a day citywide to meet our minimum staffing in patrol. Again, this is first responders. So as an example, Sunday night in Maryvale, Estrella Precinct, we have the 81 King Squad, the 82 King Squad, and the 83 King Squads. Those 3 squads cover that precinct. The officers assigned to those squads right now equal a total of 20 officers. Our minimum staffing for that area is 23 officers. So every week on that day, we are calling in at least 3 officers on overtime. It just gives you an idea of the amount of officers that have left the department, have left our first responder pool, but we have to maintain a certain level of minimum staffing. So that's where we're spending a lot of our money. The fix to this, and the positive part of this, is through your leadership, we've started to hire. Now this fiscal year in July, we've had to ramp back up. We haven't hired in about 6 years, so we had to pull officers from patrol to build our tactical training detail down at the academy, background investigators, recruiting officers. All those are about 10 sergeants and almost 50 officers that we had to pull to start our hiring efforts. We're doing a pretty good job. We've had 46 people that have been hired and graduated the academy in the first 6 months of this year. We have another academy graduation coming up, which is good. We have 63 people in the academy. So we are going to continue to push people out and hire, and that's huge for us. So we're really looking forward to that, and we'll continue to update you as we go in the next couple months as far as our hiring goes and as far as our overtime expenditures go. And that's kind of just the basic gist of why we're higher in overtime the first 6 months of this year compared to the last 6 months of last year. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Councilmember Pastor.
So it says officers left department year 2015. That's 168 officers. If I do the math, and I hope I'm doing it right, 46 and 63 leave 109, and I take the 3 off, then there's 56 positions still vacant. What are we doing with those 56 positions?
Mr. Chairman, member of the subcommittee, you're exactly right. And if I can add to your math numbers a little bit,
Okay.
in the first 6 months of 2016, we lose 48 more officers in the drop system alone.
Okay.
So it's gonna take us a while to get over that curve, because as you just pointed out, we're not hiring just to meet attrition. We're not making that mark. So if we lost 168 in 2015, and we have 43 or 63 plus 46, that doesn't equal 168. So we're still on the short end of the stick, and that's going to happen for a little bit longer until we can get our hiring going. We have authorized for this fiscal year 299 hires. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We probably won't meet that number. We'll probably be a little bit over 200, but we're going to work very, very hard to hire quality and hire as many people as we possibly can. And in time, it'll help us reduce our overtime because it'll replenish our patrol deployment and our patrol officers.
Now, Chief, with those 48 that we're going to be losing, those are individuals that are in the drop program.
Correct.
Now, there's individuals that can actually move on to different cities or whatever, or retire early. That's not a part of these numbers too, right?
No, it's not. And we can talk about those numbers. We average about 4 a month in attrition. So that's another, 50 officers a year plus. So we're going to be in this battle for a while. And we'll get through it. Our biggest goal is we have to be safe on the street, and we have to make sure we have enough officers reporting to work on given squads and given parts of our city so that the officers have the resources to be safe out there and provide the service.
And then one other question is that being short-staffed, we're still decreasing in crimes and homicides and all that, right?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I mean, in the end of 2015, we had 113 total homicides. That's the lowest that the Phoenix Police Department has been since 1988. So our crime, and a lot of major cities are judged by their homicide rate. Our homicide rate is very good because we're at almost a 30-year low. So crime is staying constant. We don't have our numbers in for the end of this year, but we'll be close to either even or maybe 1% as compared to 2015. And in 2015, we were down 3% as compared to 2014. So our crime is moving in the right direction. And it specifically is property crime. Our property crime we're doing very well, and I attribute that to the police officers, but also to our community. Our community is doing a very good job of being our eyes and ears and taking care of their neighborhoods.
Any other questions? Councilmember Williams?
Chief, I did not expect that overtime would be lower. You had told us last fall that you were going to have to bring in officers on overtime. I think you're doing a tremendous job. I figure we'll figure out a way to pay for it one way or the other because it is absolutely a necessity, and that's what's protecting our neighborhoods. That's what's supporting your office or your citizens on patrol, and it is obviously very effective. So I congratulate you on coming up with the plan on how to get the officers in there. I imagine not too many get to work off duty anymore because they probably are being recruited by you instead. But I think it was very inventive, and I congratulate you on a successful program.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Councilmember Gallego?
Thank you. I just think it's important that we look throughout for opportunities to be more efficient. And so if we have major events, what are the fewest number of officers where we could safely escort Ciara to the police or to our venue, and really look to be as creative as possible without hurting safety, but trying to get as many officers as possible out on patrol. And you have said to me when you talk about the homicide rate, that you're not happy until it's zero. So that when you speak about it being good news, a downward trend is good news, but what you really mean, that our goal is to really eliminate that. Is that?
That's correct. That would be great. And as far as evaluating manpower, and that's a very good point, and we do that, and we need to do a little bit more of it. But for just as an example, the events of this past weekend, we evaluated. We didn't really know what we were going to get as far as was it going to be as busy as Super Bowl or what our crowd was going to be like. So we modified our manpower, and we actually reduced it as the days went on, just being conscious of trying to be very efficient in our use of overtime.
Fabulous. I think that's very important. And I would love it if we look at what other cities have done. Understand there's some tasks that officers do not enjoy and that maybe could be done by people who are not officers to free up our officers to address safety challenges. So we talk about that often, about learning lessons from our peer cities, about how to do as much as possible with getting our officers out in the community, which is where they love to be.
Yes, ma'am, thanks.
Chief, I'd like to thank you once again for looking at other areas that we can cut, especially with the overtime increasing, and also with Mr. Mahoney's efforts in looking at creative ways of our downtown. We have many events going on, from Margaret Hans Park to that Block 23, the College Bowl, and even when we have protests and marches and all that, it takes officers that aren't budgeted in our budget to handle those crowds. So we're going to come up with some creative ways to secure some funding for, especially in the downtown Central Phoenix areas where we have these types of events, and figure out ways of covering those costs in the future. Any other comments, or? Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Patricia Lucero, and I'm presenting on behalf of the Municipal Court today. And you will see today our year-to-date expenses through November of 2015 is just about under $11 million, which is about 40% of the court's budget. Our monthly expenditures are about 1.5 under budget from last year. So we have just 1.5 under there. Our expenses, again, are accumulation of personnel and the top 10 personnel expenses. And our revenues collected are 7% down, which is consistent with our filings that we've had over the past year. So that would explain the number that 7% down of our revenue collected. And happy to answer any questions.
Any comments? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Nowakowski and members of the subcommittee. I'm Ken Lake. I'm reporting for the fire department. So our budget is $309 million. You can see we've spent 39.6 at 41% of the year. So we're tracking just slightly under what our overall budget is for the year. As a breakdown of expenditures monthly, we're pretty much, we didn't see anything that really stood out. We're 2.5% ahead of last year, but we'll get into actually where those come from. The top 10 expenditures are much like our police department. A large portion of it is going to be personnel services. We're up in salaries and pension, insurance. We're actually down in constant staffing, which is a little different than our police department counterparts. It's something that we've been doing for a long time with staffing. We have started the hiring process, much like police department has. In December and January, we started to see a downtick, and it was related to getting up to closer to full staffing. So we're challenged a little bit the same way they are, is pumping people through the academy, getting them out on the streets, and keeping up with attrition. But a good note for us is that's going down a little bit. Equipment charges are up, and then some of the other personnel services are up, with the exception of general pension contributions. Probably the high note for us is in our revenues. Our ambulance transports continue to do much better than they did last year. We're up about $2 million as of this report, which is in November. We're still collecting fees for the dispatch system and dispatch maintenance, and those are pretty much on target, but overall about $2 million over what we had last year. And I'd be also happy to take any questions.
Any comments? I just want to thank you all for giving these reports and explaining the increases, and also the courts. I mean, we're down by 7% from last year, and with the fire, the revenues are up by $2 million. So I think it's important that we have this on televised, that individuals can actually see where our budgets are being spent. So it's not just during those budget hearings, but we see it throughout the year. So thank you for reporting and helping us understand how the budget's being spent. We have actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individuals that like to comment on this item. Starting off with Jeff Woods.
You want him to stay?
If you'd like to stay up here to comment on We like to keep we like to keep you on the hot seat. We like to keep you on the hot seat, Chief.
Hi, Jeff Woods, 15234 North 23rd Drive, Phoenix, Arizona, 85023. My comment is in regard to the police. We've worked with Kurtenbach over the past 3 or 4 months. We've also met with the mayor's team as well. Never got any response from the mayor's team, but thank you for the police have been much more obliged to talking to us. And Kurtenbach had recently, he reached out to us this week and said that there would be, he was proposing that 1,100 body cameras be issued to the Phoenix Police Department and that be fully employed by July of this year. So I just wanted to make sure that that was maybe discussed in the budget, or how is it going to be paid for? So my main question is that our concerns as a community are that from 2009 to 2014, Phoenix has the highest per capita rate of police killings. In 2015, ranked number 4 in the country. Out of the 10 people killed in Phoenix over the last year, 4 of those 10 were not armed with a firearm. 1 had a vehicle that was considered a weapon. 1 had a knife. 1 man was throwing rocks, and the other one was unarmed. So our concern is that the size of our city doesn't comply with the amount of people being killed. I mean, for example, New York from 2010 to 2013 had more fatal shootings than Phoenix, even though New York City has 5.5 times the population. And I do appreciate the fact that the homicide rate is going down, but when you have 113 people killed over 1.5 million, and then you have 2,000 officers who kill 10, I feel like there's just disproportionality there, and we're very concerned that things like body cameras, police review board, maybe a early intervention system is another option that would help with the trust, and I think that would also help with the recruiting of police. If you build more trust with the police, and it's more in the limelight as far as the media goes, that that it would be good for recruiting as well if we address some of the accountability and transparency issues within the Phoenix Police Department. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Woods?
I'm Joanne Scott Woods. I'm offering a solution for reducing officer-involved shootings in Phoenix, as well as a solution for reducing payments in successful lawsuits by families of fallen citizens, and thereby increasing funding for the police budget. The current personnel assessment system is not working, as evidenced by the OIS review, which under current orders of operation is basically self-reporting and reporting by supervisor or a coworker. The adoption of an early intervention system similar to that of the Seattle PD would save lives not only of officers and citizens.
Ms. Woods, I'm sorry, but this item is posted for a budget update. So if you can relate it to the budget somehow, then we can actually.
So can it be included in the budget next?
Next
year's budget, I would recommend it.
When you talk about an issue, I'll put this on pause. When you talk about an issue, you have to stick on budget. So how does this relate to the budget?
I think it would increase our budget by reducing the amount that we pay out in lawsuits to it. And there are so many more details in the threshold levels of indicators that officers are at risk for behavior. Can I go on?
As long as it relates to this current budget.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. The SPD was the result of a DOJ investigation, which can cost the city a lot of money which we don't want the budget to be impacted by that either. I'll just sum it up. It took them $11 million to develop this, which we don't want to spend, and $1 million to implement it each year, and 6 years was in the making. We need a comprehensive system to monitor at-risk behavior of our law enforcement, and this would save us money and lives in the long run.
Thank you, Mrs. Woods. Next, we have Dulce.
Good morning, City Council members. My name is Dulce Juarez. I'm with ACLU. I'm the Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator there. I'm here to talk about the CPTI, the Community and Policing Trust Initiative, that again relates because these 9 recommendations that this committee put out will probably be implemented or in some form will be related to the balance to this budget. We'd like to ask you, City Council Member Nowakowski, actually, to direct City Manager and staff today that these 9 recommendations that were made by the CPTI last year are presented in the next Public Safety Committee meeting. This process has not been a public nor transparent one. Our office requested last year to speak to this group, and we were in order to provide more information to the CPTI committee. And much of these, and to talk about much of these needed reforms that are discussed in the budget, we were denied access to this meeting. And so therefore, Chairman Nowakowski.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
we have to talk about the item that's
Yeah.
posted. And this is about a current budget item.
Mm-hmm.
And what we can do is in future agenda items, we can put this on as an agenda item so we can speak about it. If it's
Yes.
during public comment, you can talk about any issues that you like, but because of it's posted as a current budget, I don't see how it's related to our current budget right now.
Well, we just would like for transparency and for the community to be included in these types of meetings because it does relate to the police budget and this wasn't included. So we would like for you, City Council Member Nowakowski, to direct City Manager today for there to be community input in this process because there was not community input and we were not allowed into these meetings. That's all.
We'll ask
Thank you.
that to be put on a future agenda item so that we can address that.
Councilwoman Gallego requested that earlier in our public comment piece. Needs to be some clarity. We need to talk about the item that we are talking, the current item that we are talking about. So if we're talking about overtime, we can speak about overtime, the overtime budget, or false alarms, or hiring of police officers, our monthly expenditures. And so just to add some clarity of what's going, why we're shifting the way we're shifting. If you want that for public comment, then we can put item 8 as public comment, and then you could speak on the item. So it's up to, I think there's several other people.
You know, the only problem is that we posted public comment at the beginning, and we can't change the agenda because it was posted 24 hours prior. So once again, it will be put on as a future agenda item, as Councilmember Gallegos requested. So with that, Mrs. Rogers. And once again, regarding the current budget, the police, fire, or our courts.
Chairman Nowakowski and members of the committee and members who are here in attendance. My name is Greta Rogers. With regard to budget, I want a copy of all that was presented here, please. And I'll pay for it. But the city is in a very natal stage of considering next year's budget. With regard to police and fire, I want clear identification of the recruitment needs by each department, the time, the cost of recruiting, of training, of the probationary or internship period that an officer, after he's certified from the academy, has passed all the requirements, all that probationary period before a member can be on the street or at a station with the crew without an intern guide next to him. I want all that cost, and I want it because I want you to make it priority 3 in the 3 top budget priorities for 16-17. These departments have both been seriously neglected over the last 8 years, along with other things I won't get into. But we can no longer play hide and seek.
Thank you, Mrs. Rogers. Next will be Walt Gray.
Thank you, Councilman Nowakowski and council members. I'd like to raise a couple of questions as to, have we done a study of why police officers leave the police department?
What?
A study of why police officers leave the department.
I did speak, the Human Resources Department interviews them as they leave, and they have been keeping us abreast of the reasons.
Mr. Gray, if you can actually relate it to the current budget, then we can actually talk about this.
Well, I think that we've lost officers, we're hiring officers, we're substituting, we're paying overtime because of the drop in officers. And that's my relationship. So I think while it's good that each officer goes through an exit interview, I think it'd be good to compile all of that going back through the recession, because that's when the officers left and when we couldn't replace them. So I think that would be a good information for the public to know. Also, I think it'd also be good to have a study. You know, we keep talking about crime going down. Crime has been going down for 20 years overall. And
Mr. Gray, once again, how does this relate to the current?
Well, again, Councilman, my feeling is that we're talking about crime. Crime's going down. We're hiring more police officers. Part of that's because we've lost police officers. But we don't understand why crime's going down. You know, is it the police officers? Is it community policing? Is it because we have more people locked up? Longer sentences, all these things are all involved, but there are other things. And so I think it'd be good, the ASU has a criminal justice department, and I think that it'd be good to ask them to look at it, and maybe not just the city, or maybe
And
the
if you
county.
can wrap it up relating to, thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you.
And then we got Heather.
Councilman Nowakowski, I
Uh-huh.
actually wanted to speak on the CPTI process, so I can cede my time since it's on an agenda for future.
All right, thank you so much. And then we have John. How you doing? And this is, once again, we're on the item of current budget.
I'm a former mayor, mister, so I understand agenda and process.
Oh, thank you so much.
There you go. I would just like to bring it up as to the budget and where it is, and the chief saying that they're under budget even though at a 5-year period. I would also like to suggest that perhaps you have more satellite units within veteran communities. There's only 3 veteran communities that are in Phoenix for the purpose of the issues of, and I'm just going to say it and forgive me, civilian intercourse with veterans that have PTSD. And I was wondering if there was a budget disposition that could allow for that, because I know those veteran communities would welcome a satellite police station with officers, these great officers that help the veterans every day. Veterans salute these officers because they do come out, they are responsive, and they're quick to their response. And as the American Legion District Representative for District 7, sitting on the National Committee for Employment and Education for the American Legion, I would ask that you consider that, and you consider agendizing that and bringing budgetary process to this. Also, I would like to ask for an issue to be put on the agenda concerning an American Legion resolution. I've given one to Ms. Williams, and I have others for the council members here at large. Thank you very much, sir.
And with that, that's the end of the public comments. And thank you so much for the budget. Thank you so much for passing on. Now we're on item number 9. The ordinance on chaining dogs.
Thank you for putting this on the agenda. This is something that I'm very interested in, and I know the community is very interested in. So thank you, Dan, for working on this.
Good morning, Chairman Nowakowski, members of the subcommittee. Great to see all of you. I am Dan Brown. I'm with the City of Phoenix Law Department. Here to my right is Ian White, who is with our office. We're here this morning to present information, and there are items of discussion. It's only been noticed for discussion and information, so no requested action at this time. So related to the chaining of dogs and tethering. Dogs, like people, are social animals, and yet thousands of dogs spend their entire lives at the end of a chain. Constantly tied up outside, dogs become lonely, they become bored, anxious, and often neglected of proper food and shelter. They can also develop aggressive behavior. So we are looking to address this issue. Many communities across the country have developed an ordinance to address the tethering and chaining of dogs, to address not only the citizens' health, but the health of dogs. So here are just a few quick examples of what happens. So what have been the responses? The ordinance have taken the form of outright bans. There have been time restrictions or limits. There have been restrictions for extreme weather, which definitely would apply to Phoenix in the summertime. Restrictions on the types of tethering, length, and manner. Regulation of living space, the types of collars, tether, or environment. And some specific examples, I believe, for example, New Hanover and Live Oak have both been outright bans. Orange County, Florida, and the state of Rhode Island have extreme time and weather restrictions. So as I said, this is an item for information, and just to let the subcommittee know that we are going to submit a request as far as the next step to the entire council, requesting to exceed the 8-hour rule so that we can work with various interest groups in the community to develop an ordinance, and we will be bringing that draft ordinance back to this subcommittee for your review and discussion sometime in late spring. So with that, we are open to any questions.
Councilmember Williams?
First, I need to ask Mr. Mahoney, I know we can't take action on this. Can this go directly to the council, however, for the 8-hour rule if it sounds like people are interested without taking a vote?
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Williams, yes, we understand the intent, so we can get something put on there so we can move forward. And even sort of projecting where this is going, we won't stop working, but we do need the formality of getting that passed.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and fellow council members, this is something I've been working with the Humane Society. I fully understand that there are some places that it could be appropriate to tether a dog, providing they still have mobility and access to shade and water and food. So I'm hoping we can find the language there, and I think what the Humane Society is proposing is something that we could probably massage and really look and give serious consideration. But I know last year the police officers, thousands of those calls, and the calls that the Humane Society went out on abuse were tethered animals that had either wound themselves around a tree, were fully in the sun, had no water, no food, and were in serious shape. And I think this is a problem that we need to address. As you know, I'm a firm believer, if you treat your dog like that, you're probably not treating your kids much better. And to me, this is all part of family violence, and I think it's something that we need to do to make people aware and to take some action on. As the co-chair with Councilman Nowakowski on that Animal Abuse Prevention Task Force a few years ago. This was one of the topics we talked about tackling in the future, and we know how serious the problem is. So I'm hoping that we can just take this, get the 8 hours, and have them come up with some draft language that the council can approve.
Any other comments? Councilmember Gallego?
Thank you to Councilwoman Williams for her leadership on this issue, and thank you for your research. I think it's important that this ordinance reflect our sometimes extreme summer heat in Phoenix, and so that as we look to other communities, that access to water and shade might be particularly important in our Phoenix area, but to look for best practices across. And thank you. Look forward to supporting this 8-hour vote.
With that, thank you so much for the information, and can't wait to see that at the council meeting. Item number 10. This was brought up several times today, so we got some good news.
This one is very exciting. It was something I think the council challenged our new chief presiding judge to, and it looks like you have answered very quickly, so looking forward to this.
Well, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, I am excited to be here today to talk to you about the new program that we are on the verge of going live with, and we'll actually be talking about specific dates today. But I also think it's good timing. You know, I'm sensitive to the question that Mr. Garcia asked earlier, and I think part of what we're going to be talking about as we do this presentation and talk about the issue will address some of those concerns. I've brought with me Ms. Esther Reeves, the court's controller for many years, and Assistant Presiding Judge Eric Jeffrey, both of whom have been enormously important parts of our design of the program that we're entering into right now. And I have to say, it was actually an idea that Judge Jeffrey sparked the conversation with many months ago that led to what we're about to talk to you about. We really have two sort of overarching goals as we're looking at the program that we're announcing today. The first of those is with much of what we do really about accountability. At the end of the day, I want to be clear about what this program is that I'm talking about and what it's not. And what it's not is an amnesty. At the end of the day, what we propose to do is create a path whereby we facilitate people, we assist them in being able to be fully compliant with their financial obligations. So nothing about this program is going to be forgiving prior obligations that were put in place by the court based on the offenses that were committed. We'll talk a little bit about, there will be some financial benefits to defendants involved, but it's not going to involve obligations that would otherwise be coming to the city. So it is about accountability. At the same time, it's important that it's about opportunity, because as we assist people to be fully compliant, it really mitigates for those members of the community some of the collateral consequences that come from failing to comply with financial obligations of the court. The biggest of those probably being the fact that when someone fails to appear at their court date, or they fail to pay an obligation that the court has ordered on civil traffic charges, we are required to notify MVD, and MVD suspends the person's license until such time as that obligation is made compliant. That can have enormous effects on people's lives and their ability to go forward, and actually also on their ability to continue to comply with the court's orders. So we've really tried to be conscious of both of these things as we design the program. I wanted to give you a bit of an illustration with the next one about how it is that fines that are imposed at the court can become bigger than they sound, and really how it is that people can end up sometimes with significant financial obligations based on those offenses. You begin with the $100 base fine, if you will, and this is just an example for illustrative purposes. There is an immediate addition of $15. That is by city ordinance. That is to the court's Technology Enhancement Fund. And that has been actually very important to the court for many years in terms of our ability to enhance our technology, our ability to process cases, our ability to do that in an efficient manner. And we actually are able to fund much of our IT infrastructure and our personnel through that fund. Everything after that comes at the state level. So the state adds an 83% surcharge to that tech fee. The state then adds an 83% surcharge to the base fine. State then adds another $13 separate surcharge as it goes in there. The state then adds a $20 probation fee, which is directed over to Maricopa County, the Superior Court there to help them fund their probation services. One of the newest ones was a $2 surcharge added just a couple of years ago by the state legislature to fund some victims' rights at the state level. And then there is a $7 fee that is added at the Supreme Court level that is designed to help courts be able to continue to collect on their financial obligations and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not here to comment on the wisdom of any of those. That's simply the law as we're required to apply it. But you can see why what otherwise might seem like smaller fine amounts become larger numbers at that area. And all of this money that is directed at the state level surcharges and elsewhere is by law, by statute, directed into specific funds for specific purposes and then used at the state level. And it's for a variety of things. So, the Compliance Assistance Program. We're very sensitive to the fact that over the course of many years, there are people who have come and they've either failed to appear or they have appeared and been found responsible on civil traffic tickets, and then have entered into a payment arrangement with us that they've not been able to keep. And so really what we're directing today's program is at, who we're directing it at in terms of assistance, are really thousands of people. There are thousands of people who have previously had financial obligations adjudged against them but are no longer compliant. We really took this in two phases. Immediately in August of 2015, I directed our financial enforcement staff to be more flexible in the way that we approach individuals who end up with large sums of money that they cannot pay on the day that it's imposed. The reason for that being that I think it's been our experience that if people are stretched in their ability to make those monthly payments, that obligation to the court is one of the first things that ends up not being paid when some of the things that happen to all of us in life happen. With months down the road, when the car blows up, somebody gets sick, we are, I think, one of the first people that stop getting paid. And then because of the nature of who we are, being at the court, I think people are nervous. And so we end up with people that may not contact us. And so years later, they can end up with these amounts owed. At one point, they had a payment plan that they negotiated with us, but they've stopped paying. We have very few tools at that point for those people. After a fair amount of time in which we've tried to contact them, in which we have tried to get them back on track, if they're ignoring us, we work with partners in the private sector in the form of collection agencies, and the collection agencies work those cases. But we have very few. We have very few other tools. My great hope is that as we enter into this era of being more flexible with people in their ability to pay, and we really set achievable payment plans for them, we will find better long-term compliance rates. And that long-term compliance is important for several reasons, one of them being that it is by far the most efficient use of the court's resources, and number two, that really is what allows people to not have to deal with the collateral consequences. If they're compliant and they're paying us off over time, they don't end up with that license suspension as a result of failing to pay that particular obligation. So we're really hoping to see over time, again, better long-term compliance rates and fewer people that end up in a situation where they would need the benefit of where we're moving next anyway. The next one really is phase two. It is the Compliance Assistance Program. It was much bigger, and the reason that it's now instead of August is that it has taken 5 months of very diligent work by the court staff to be able to do some reprogramming of the court's management system, court's case management system. This is tied into everything we do. We have a very high volume of cases, and our ability to do that is dependent on our being able to manage cases and have automated business processes through our case management system. I showed you a moment ago how the fine becomes bigger. Well, there's also a very complex set of regulations that govern when we collect all of that money, how it gets sent out, how it's distributed, how it's calculated. All of that had to be reprogrammed for us to be able to do what we're doing. Starting on January 25th, I can't stress that enough. We're not prepared if people came down today to be able to do that, but starting January 25th, we will be able to do it. And the specifics of the program are that people who owe us these large outstanding obligations that they don't have the means to pay in full will be able to come in and talk to us or send us correspondence and talk to us. We will calculate for them a reasonable down payment amount. We have come up with a formula that is very conscious of all of the regulations about the priorities of payments and all of that. But it is a reasonable amount that we found over years. People who come in may owe us $2,000, certainly don't have that in their pocket, but generally a couple of $100s is reasonably within reach. So we will set this very reasonable down payment. It'll be based on the number of charges and the person's individual situation. We will then negotiate with them as to a very reasonable payment plan with very achievable payment terms for them so that we can see long-term compliance. Because, of course, if they remain compliant, we're all better off. We will significantly reduce collection costs. Now, the collection costs are something that is added to the outstanding balance when we are in a position where we have to send it off to the collection agency because the person hasn't been compliant with us. If they come in through this program, we will significantly reduce those. And those can be significant in terms of the amount that's added. I talked earlier about how this is not something that redirects any money that would come to the city. Those collection costs are specifically added and are then kept by the collection agencies. So we're still collecting everything that would come to the city. And then the centerpiece, and probably one of the most important from the community's perspective, is that when that down payment is made and the continuing payments are negotiated, we will generate an MVD clearance. We will tell MVD that they are back in compliance with the court, and that will release that particular hold on their ability to get the license back. So the bottom line is, I think what we're doing is opening a path for thousands of people who really want to be in compliance. They don't want to suffer those consequences of a suspended license because all that brings. But they simply haven't had the wherewithal to come up with the full amount that they owe us. We're creating a path for them to be able to do that, again, with full accountability. So I'm very excited about our ability to do that, starting again on January 25th. Some of you, actually all of you, I think, were here when 4 years ago we had our new opportunity warrant clear-up program. We called it Now CU. This was directed at a different group of people. These were people who had outstanding arrest warrants, which is not the case for the people who have traffic tickets. They had outstanding arrest warrants. We spent a week in which we made very clear publicly to people in the community that we were there to help them clear up those warrants. It was a safe space for them to come down because the week after that, the police were going to be out rounding people up. Well, we learned some very important lessons 4 years ago that are instructive in what we're doing here. One of them is that people want to be in compliance, especially if they feel like there is a safe way for them to come down to the court and do it. And we found that those people who came back into the system through that program had very good long-term compliance rates. They were happy to be back in compliance, and they continued to do that at much better rates than we'd ever seen anywhere else. The other thing we learned is that the community quickly gets the word, and it spreads by word of mouth. During those 5 days, the number of participants we had in the courthouse doubled every day, and you may recall some of the news shots of that Friday when we had probably, the fire chief is still here, we had probably far too many people in the lobby. But it was hugely successful, and we learned a lot of things from that. This is designed for a different group of people who are suffering from some different collateral consequences. But it will be an ongoing program, and it's one whereby I hope we can really set the tone that we're here to help assist you in being compliant. We're open to do that. If you have these outstanding obligations, come down. because we are all better off. Like the clear your warrant, clear your conscience, clear your mind, this program is more about clearing up those lingering doubts and clearing up those collateral consequences that you may have, getting back on track, and being able to proceed without the worry of what's hanging out there about these things. If I can, really quickly, I wasn't planning on addressing it as part of this, but I think Mr. Garcia's point was a good one. It's a good question that he asked, and I remember very clearly when that came up during the interview process last summer. With regard to private probation companies, we have never used private probation companies. We do not use methods in which we bring in somebody from the private sector who gets to charge you a monthly fee of $40 in order to collect fines. We've never used them. I'm not aware, I can't promise no one else in Arizona uses them, but I'm not aware of any of them, and I'm pretty aware of what most of the other limited jurisdiction courts do. And I think the good news is we haven't used them in Arizona. My own personal opinion from having looked at the way that they operate is that's a huge problem, and that does put people in these perpetual cycles. That's not our goal. We don't want to do that. We really are here to help provide opportunity for people. With that, I'll ask if the subcommittee has any questions, and I will throw up that number there, which hopefully members of the public will see, so that if you have questions about it, again, with our start date of Monday, January 25th.
Any questions?
I have some questions. How much money are you talking about that's uncollected?
Well, let me answer with two things. If you're looking just at the amount of outstanding financial obligations on all charges over the last 20 years, we have a little over $300 million that is outstanding.
$300 million. Okay.
Yes. Now, as you can see by the earlier illustration I had about the where some of that money goes,
Right.
A significant portion of that certainly is owed to the general fund. Much of it is also owed at the state level. Now, not all of that represents the people that this program is directed at, but it's a fair number of them.
Okay.
So our hope, my hope really, is that as we go forward on this and provide this opportunity for people, we will really start to begin collecting on that money that's outstanding.
Right. So are you going back 20 years? Anybody that far? And that's who you're going to,
Well, this will be open to anybody. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, Councilman Williams. This will be open to anybody who has those outstanding obligations on civil traffic tickets, even if it goes back that far.
okay. Now, are you going to put something in our buses or in the light rail? Because it seems like if you've lost your driver's license, you may be on the bus, and this would be an opportunity.
Mr. Chair, Councilwoman Williams.
Bus stops?
That's a great point. And we have looked at what we can do to get the word out. I think we'll find that a lot of it does spread by word of mouth, but we will also be looking for opportunities to get the word out to the public.
Looks like a public service announcement to me, PSA. That could probably be a freebie somewhere.
Mr. Chair, Councilman Williams, you're absolutely right, and I know that in talking to members of the subcommittee, we've talked about some specific outreach to the press. Chairman Nowakowski, for example, I know is interested in making sure that Spanish language media has something that we get out there, so we're looking at that. We will welcome any and all publicity at any source we can get, and we will be taking a look at really at what kind of response we get and trying to track ways that we can further get the word out depending on the success of the program.
I know when we did the PSA for the animals, we had that filmed by our own local people, and Cox played it voluntarily, and a couple of our local channels played it in off hours. So I think there's all kinds of possibilities, because I think the key to the success is getting the word out there as soon as possible. I commend you for coming up with this, both of you. I think it's a tremendous idea, and to think nearly $100 million could be coming to your direction, this sounds very good at this time. Thank you for your hard work.
Mr. Chair, Councilwoman Williams, thank you. I would love to see that. I don't know that $100 million is in the offing, but we will do our best. That is absolutely true.
Councilmember Gallego?
Taking a hard look at fees and our collections was my top priority for the new Chief Presiding Justice, and I really want to thank you for taking this on. It is a win for taxpayers and a win for the people in our court system. Many people enter our court system unwillingly. They can be confused about dust regulations and parking. Many people let a bill slip driving without insurance, and these things can tumble out of control, or we can help educate people and get them into compliance. It is a win for our taxpayers if we can collect this money and if we can help people avoid what got them there in the first place. So thank you for your leadership. We have stacks of uncollected or open cases, and want to acknowledge Judge Jeffries for really helping us address that as well. It's certainly been a team effort at the court system, and one that will continue. We are not done. But it is really good news that we are not going to be pushing people to max out their credit cards. We want our residents to be able to get into compliance, but sustainably. We don't want to push people into making bad financial decisions. Making bad financial decisions means they are less likely to pay their costs and that they might get into further trouble, that a small fee can grow very quickly. The state legislature has passed a lot of the tax collection for agencies that have nothing to do with the city to us. We are funding the Department of Public Safety through the Phoenix Court Collection System. And for that reason, and many others, it really does grow to be a larger financial burden on people. They are paying for costs. This is a population that is easy to throw fees on. There's not a lot of political support for people in the court system, but they are paying for things that have nothing to do with their ticket for parking in an area that has not been dust-proofed. But at least the city of Phoenix is stepping up and saying, we're going to try to make it possible for you to do this. We understand that for many residents in the city of Phoenix, a car is an enormously important part of their ability to learn a living and pay these fees. So we can't overstate the importance of letting people keep their cars as they attempt to get in compliance. These are often very minor fees, but they grow quickly and can become a real burden for people who are living close to the edge. And so thank you for your leadership on this. I think this is something we're going to need to continue to work on, but it really is something that we ought to celebrate today and make sure that we do educate the public. I think early on there'll be a lot of press, and that will take care of it, and then maybe you can come back to us in a few months and we can take up the excellent suggestions from Councilwoman Williams, among many others. Probably we should pilot this early, make sure we have a good system, but then really get out there and see if we can't collect more money and address the concerns of people who are very nervous about not having a driver's license or growing fees. So thank you for your leadership in this area, and we look forward to being your partners as we continue to implement.
And Councilmember Gallegos, thank you for your leadership and your passion on this issue, because if you look at it, I mean, just educating ourselves, a $100 fee becomes a $252 obligation for an individual. All those tacked on service charges and all at the state level and at the county level, it starts to add up. So I just really like to thank you for keeping those individuals that are trying to make ends meet, and they have a fixed budget. And a lot of people are retired that have a fixed budget that they have to live by. So this would really help them out. And once again, we hear stories over and over about somebody not being able to drive to work and not being able to use their vehicle, or even getting their vehicle impounded because they don't have a driver's license. So it's just those kinds of horror stories that we'll stop it by implementing this. So thank you so much for your leadership and all of my colleagues.
Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, thank you. And thank you for your enthusiasm and support as we move forward. We're very excited about this. This is step one. We have already identified areas that we wish to continue to look further at, using those same goals of accountability, but providing opportunity to individuals who are part of the system. So I look forward to being able to come back to you again in the future and talk about these things.
And we do have one comment card from Walt Gray.
Thank you, Councilman Nowakowski and council members. I'd just like to follow up on what Councilwoman Gallego said. I think she made a very good observation. My thought is that maybe the intergovernmental department, the legislative liaison for the city, would start to address these issues at the state level to match, not just because the county court, I mean the municipal courts, and having this problem of obligations, but also just to go about matching benefits with costs and matching agencies with costs. County Superior Court is funded by the county. The state appellate court is funded by the state. And municipal court is funded by the city. So there might be some surcharges necessary for the city. I think we should ask the state, because there is even issues in the governor's state of the state that there looks like the state is trying to control cities more. We know both city and county have been passed down many additional costs because of the recession, and we'll see if they're going to be reversed. But I just think that it might be a good thing to do. Thank you.
Alrighty. Any closing comments?
No, again, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, we're just very excited about it, and I do appreciate your support. And as I said, we'll be back.
Alrighty, we're on item number 12. Thank you so much. Future agenda items?
You got the
Mr. Chairman.
GP something.
We have a special meeting coming up in 2 weeks to deal with judicial reappointments, and that's what's next in front of you. If you have any additional items, we'll take them
Already?
for
I think
subsequent meetings.
I think for that following meeting, we're looking at that Councilmember Gallegos brought up the CPTI update, if
Yes.
we can get that. I think we also talked about crime, just a report from the chief on the decrease of crime and just a little bit more detail on that. Any other? And I think we need to have something with fire. We have the chief here, and we didn't get to have her speak today, so
No recruiting.
she can talk about recruiting. Thank you for your hard work and efforts. Anything else? One of the things that we're seeing a lot of is we're getting a lot of the marijuana and dispensaries coming into the city of Phoenix, and especially in about 3 or 4 different districts. I'd like to look at that and what type of ordinances that we as the city of Phoenix can actually do on this, so that we just don't have clusters of dispensaries in certain areas of our city, and also the best practices of other cities that are out there, and what are other cities doing regarding this. I'm not sure if there's any other comments on that, or
Actually, I chair the Neighborhood Housing and Development Committee, and we are looking at the land use side of that in terms of clustering, but perhaps it would be appropriate for this subcommittee to look at the public safety side. For example, it is because of banking regulations, they have a large amount of cash, and that places a burden on our law enforcement. And I am not convinced that with the proposals moving forward that we will be able to recapture our costs to the city, and I think we ought to educate our taxpayers about those costs, because there's a lot of discussion around funding. And
As part of that, can we have an explanation on how, after you're in operation for so many years, you can go wherever you want, and how that works, and what the impact is having on us? Because to me, I'm very concerned about the issues that Councilwoman Gallego talked about, because large amount of cash, and you have people just start moving in here and there in vacant buildings. It makes me very nervous that what's going to happen in the future. We haven't had a major one yet, but we have a whole new wave coming in, and I'm very concerned there. taking the measures that the first people did, so.
My understanding this week at the Scottsdale City Council meeting, they have moved forward on restricting the number of dispensaries coming into their community, and Tempe has already passed
Oh, really?
a fairly tight restriction, on that.
Oh, really? About, so can we bring it here?
I
Okay.
think so.
Okay, great.
Yes, we'll look at that.
Are there any other future agenda items? With that, we adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
I had something, but I can't remember.